We made this.
Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and I am welcoming a new guest today, and that is Mike Lund. Mike, how you doing today?
I'm doing all right.
Good. And so before we get started with today's movie, why don't you talk a little bit about yourself?
All right. Well, during the day, I actually work for NASA managing data. And then off the clock, I sort of split my time right now between a retro video game podcast called The Old Switcheroo, where a friend and I are working our way through every retro game that the Nintendo Switch has available through their Nintendo Switch Online service. And so we're about half a year into that process of going through all those.
I imagine that's a pretty big project. It seems like I don't have a Switch, but just seeing the amount of retro games that's like available, like on PlayStation Network or on app stores and all that, it seems like quite a lot.
There's a bit over, I think, 250 games now. They keep releasing more, and so this is NES, SNES, Genesis, N64, and Game Boy. And so we do each episode. We do 2 or 3 of them.
Oh, okay. So
yes.
When you whoops, my son's knocking stuff over in the background. Sorry if you guys are hearing that. So I've actually, it's kind of funny you said that. I wasn't aware of that when we started exchanging emails, but I've actually just coincidentally been doing some retro gaming myself lately. I replayed. Lately, I've had a little bit more time now that I completed this comic book project, and I replayed Final Fantasy VII Remake, and that gave me the itch to go back and play Xenogears. So I fired up my Recall Box emulation system, and I've been diving into that over the past week or so. So how do you guys decide what games to cover, and do you play the whole game to prepare for the episode, or do you just kind of like sample it before you jump into the discussion?
So we've kind of broken things up into episodes that make sense. Either they're parts of franchises or they're games that have similar themes. So the most recent episodes we've done, a couple baseball games is one episode. We just released the first 2 Zelda games, which I had never played before. And then we've recorded one that is 4 games that are not all related, that are all caveman games. And so all of these are playing enough to get a sense of them.
Mm-hmm.
Partially because a lot of these are hard.
Yeah.
And usually we have guests on, but the friend that I'm co-hosting this with, we generally have a pattern that I'm basically going into these games the same way that you would have gone into these games in the 80s or the 90s, which is I read the manual, I try playing the game with sort of the functionality that was in the game to begin with. He's been approaching these using with a lot of the stuff that you can do with the Nintendo Switch and how it emulates the games, which allows you to do things like save the games at various points or rewind if something didn't go well. He's also a better gamer, so he gets through a lot more stuff than I do. So I've beaten some of the games that we've played. He's beaten much more of them. We always at least make sure that we have a sense of the game. And then it's kind of a question of how much we can get through. And some of those are games that you can beat in an hour, and some of those are 20 or 30 hours. So that kind of plays into it too.
Yeah, I remember that. The one I still have nightmares of is the original NES Ninja Turtles game. That was just unbelievably merciless, and they had released the Cowabunga collection. I think it was like last year, actually. Now, which had like all the NES, Super Nintendo, Genesis, and arcade games all in one package. And one of the things that they didn't do, which I'm really annoyed about, is they didn't have any sort of like real type of game enhancements for that NES version of the original Ninja Turtles game, because that game is just so unbelievably punishing.
Yeah, it's been one of the frustrating things is that Nintendo, when they started rolling these out for, or at least for Nintendo and Super Nintendo,
Mhm.
they also included some game modes that would basically start you off, either start you off at a further level or start you off with additional things unlocked. Um, I'm working through Mario Kart right now, and that has a mode to basically go in, and it already has the remaining tracks unlocked. So you don't have, yeah.
So,
So one of
sorry, go ahead.
yeah. So one of the, so it's been nice that for the NES, the SNES, you can kind of jump back in without having to unlock everything. But then going through the Nintendo 64, which has a lot of games that had a lot of content that you unlocked over time,
Mm-hmm.
it is a little bit frustrating that they haven't introduced that kind of extra functionality where it's like, I never unlocked stuff on GoldenEye to begin with. I bought a used copy, I
Mm-hmm.
think, and then lent it to a friend who he and his brother unlocked everything for me and gave it to me. And now that it's all digital attached to your account, it's like I can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so anything that you have to unlock yourself. Um, you can't just get the already used copy that had already beat it, and then just go find what you want.
Yeah, yeah, that's one of the things I like about the, let's say the less on the level emulation stuff like the recall box, because you're not limited to what the developers think you want in it. You can just go through and unlock anything you want, which is a lot, which is makes things a lot easier for me.
Yeah, when you're trying to work it in with, you don't have all the time to go unlock everything. You kind of, especially if you want something where it's like, I have to play this for hours and hours and hours to unlock this
Mm-hmm.
other mode. I just want that mode.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So how long have you guys been doing this podcast?
So we started releasing episodes in August. We started recording in about April and
Mm-hmm.
building up sort of a bit of a backlog so that we'd be ready to go, so that we can be doing this fairly consistently every 2 weeks, and that we'd be prepared to sort of ride out the school year since he is a English teacher,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
and so
definitely know what that's like.
yeah.
Yeah, I do the same thing with this podcast. We record like the whole season in advance, and then we release it week after week, and then I try to plan things out so that I can schedule recording time for when I'm gonna have either a lower class load or when it's going to be on vacation. So that's worked out pretty well so far. So are there any games that you've covered so far on your show that either you that really kind of surprised you or really kind of stood out to you?
I think one of the ones that surprised me, and this is just an element of having sort of an idea of what kind of limitations they were dealing with, was um, Super Baseball Simulator 1000,
Mm-hmm.
um, which came out on the SNES, was for a franchise that I think that had gone back to the NES as well, of baseball games, that for an SNES game, I was amazed to see that you can actually do like a 165 game season where you've
Oh,
inputted it with 6 custom teams that you could put in any player stats you wanted. And it was just a level of computation that I was impressed by.
mm-hmm.
Um, where so it was almost, it wasn't even a gameplay thing. It was just the realization that I have no idea how they managed that much with sort of those limited resources.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not even a baseball fan. Um, I was just blown away by that. And so a lot of these have been going back to games and realizing when they did things that you didn't really realize that, or you appreciate that they had to figure out how to do that on
Mm-hmm.
an NES or SNES, and see stuff that really does look very impressive compared to what would come over later generations of gaming, to go, that's a lot that you were able to do with not much in the way of resources.
Yeah. Yeah, it amazes me just like how small those game how small the memory on those games is. Like I look at some of these ROM files, and I remember when I was setting up my recall box, I hooked up like a terabyte external hard drive. Just like, all right, well, I'm going to put all these different ROM packs on it, and then so I have plenty of space. And after I load everything up, I look at the available disk space, and it's like you still have like 900 gigs of memory left, or something ridiculous like that.
Yeah, no, I think one of the Kirby games was that we played was, I think, the largest game on the NES at something like a megabyte.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it's numbers that are just baffling.
Yeah. It's funny when you go back and you think about just how our perception of computer memory has changed. I remember when I was buying my first hard drive expansion back in the early 2000s, and deciding between a 250 gig and a 500 gig hard drive. And when I told a friend of mine, he's like, "What do you need a 500 gig hard drive for? Are you going to run a space station from your computer?" And now I'm sitting here with like a stack of terabyte hard drives, and that's not enough.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to me, since I grew up much more a PC gamer.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's certainly also just an element of when you have to see what you kind of have to do on a game, and you only have a D-pad and 2 or 3 or 4 buttons.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these games have been pretty creative in actually having a lot of functionality, where they figured out how to get those buttons to do a whole lot of different things at different times. Whereas growing up with PC stuff, they had a lot of keys to work with.
Yeah.
So it's been interesting to sort of see the technological aspects, some of the graphics that feel like they were ahead of what would have been expected.
Mm-hmm.
Has been fun. I think Excitebike 64 was one that my co-host was very impressed that it looks as good as it does still to him, to feel a generation or so earlier than you'd expect.
Right.
So,
well, that's cool. Yeah, people should. I'm definitely curious about this. I'm gonna have to check out some of those episodes too. Other people should as well. But let's switch tacks a little bit. Today we're a Japanese film podcast, obviously. So, what is your history with Japanese movies?
well, I'm very broadly a very large movie fan, and that's in a very general sense. And so I think it's at a certain point of watching film, especially watching, or at least to me, especially watching older film, a lot of that starts to really require getting familiar with Japanese film, just because of how it's influenced Western film.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you weren't going to go seek it out, when you start getting into things like, the first one that comes to mind would be how much of an impact Japanese film had on Western films.
Right.
And I think you've covered several of the movies that have shown up like that. And so just with watching a lot of film involved watching, being exposed to a lot of Japanese film. And I was particularly drawn, I think, to being sort of a fan of sci-fi. And there's a strong presence of Japanese film in that, with stuff like the Godzilla franchise.
Mm-hmm.
And then being a very big fan of animation, and there's so much anime there, and so much of an interplay of what's influenced what.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the case of something like Kwaidan, that kind of just comes along, that I stumbled upon thanks to Turner Classic Movies, and it looked interesting. I liked horror.
Mm-hmm.
And so it fit what I was after in a general movie. And I think at this point, I was checking my Letterboxd page just before this, and Japan comes out as like the third, or Japanese is the third highest language for what I've watched, and the highest rated.
Oh wow. Okay. So just out of curiosity, what was I imagine English was probably the first. What was the second language that came up?
French.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, especially if you're a cinephile. Then French cinemas would definitely be a huge factor in that. So what Japanese movies were kind of like your gateways into this. I know you said you'd kind of like sought them out consciously because of the influence, but what were the ones that were kind of like the first ones that grabbed your interest?
Um, I think probably the first two that come to mind, because they were both around high school, would have been Spirited Away when it was in theaters,
Mm-hmm.
and going to see that with friends that were very interested in anime and were introducing me to anime at the same time. And then around the same time, I did a film class, and one of the films that we watched then, which was Tokyo Olympiad,
Oh, okay.
which sort of it left an impression on me at the time, and then I've recently revisited, and it's my appreciation of it has gone up significantly.
That's the one about the Olympics, right? I think you had mentioned that in the
Yes,
emails. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Right.
yeah, and it's
So,
fairly fascinating because it takes a much more artistic approach to documenting the Olympics than I think a lot of other films have.
okay.
And so it's a really interesting, and I believe in that case it was not, that was not what the company wanted out of that.
Mm-hmm.
But the result is it's probably one of the films about the Olympics that actually has had the most impact and the longest legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think those were the first two.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting about there are a few things you said there that I kind of want to piggyback off of. Yeah, one of the things that's very much impressed me is that kind of like cross-cultural influence between Japanese and America in terms of movies, of TV, uh, video games as well. You know, obviously, you know that from your podcast as well. But there is such a big crossover between those two, like the obvious ones, you know, like you said, like westerns and samurai films. But even Kurosawa's early samurai films were very much influenced by detective novels. Like Yojimbo is basically Red Harvest, but set in the samurai era. Um, and and the cross cultural influence of horror, obviously with the J horror craze and all that, but also like you'd mentioned Godzilla too and the tokusatsu stuff. That's it's funny, that original the original Godzilla movie was the first Godzilla movie I saw, and it was the only movie I saw for a long time. Even still, like most of the Godzilla movies I've seen I've seen the original, I've seen Shin Godzilla, and then I've only seen the American ones. I haven't seen like any of the other Japanese ones really. Um, but that's an interesting example of a film franchise that completely different messages were taken from it in when people watched in America. A friend of mine was recently commenting on Godzilla minus one and how he said, "Well, this is not my Godzilla." He's like, "My Godzilla is like the one who is like something of a heroic character. He's defending the Earth from monsters and everything." I'm like, well, my Godzilla was all about like the war and the nuclear bombs and all that kind of stuff, because the two of the Japanese movies, Godzilla movies I watched, both of those heavily dealt with those themes.
Yeah, and that first Godzilla film is very, very interesting to me. Or I have a PhD in science, in
Oh,
physics,
okay.
and so the way that sort of talks about science and where your boundaries are was something that going into it, I'd already heard people talk about, Godzilla as very much allegorical, but I didn't realize it was going to be that poignant until I went into it, and it was an incredible movie.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and then I think I have actually watched the American version of what they did to that movie
Hmm.
that really loses all of that.
Yeah. And the reasons why aren't hard to understand. Like, if there's
Yeah,
one of my favorite scenes in that movie is when one of the politicians is talking about how we have to keep this information secret because we don't want to cause any problems with the Americans, and just like how much of a statement that was on the relationship at the time, even to this day too. And then all that stuff just gets completely excised out of the Raymond Burr version.
yeah, it's, and I also kind of wondered to what extent they even thought an audience would be prepared for something to get sort of that introspective
Hmm.
for U.S. film at the time, which actually then plays a bit of an influence on the kind of reception that Kwaidan got when it came out.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good point too. Like, especially when you think about the kinds of monster movies that were familiar to American audiences at the time. Very kind of schlocky. Very kind of maybe big on spectacle, low on content, or low on on deeper meanings. Whereas Godzilla is like the complete opposite. Yeah, there's some spectacle in there, obviously, but the there's so much other stuff going on in that movie, and it is so introspective. And same thing with Shin Godzilla. I remember American audiences were very disappointed with it when it first came out, because they're like, well, I thought Godzilla is like this big monster that destroys stuff. What's all this stuff about bureaucrats having meetings? And then you watch it from a Japanese perspective after 3/11, the tsunami, and you're like, oh wow, I totally see what they were doing with this.
Yeah, that one I still need to see. I'm very patchy on the Godzillas that I've seen. Though
We did a
I would
yeah,
say though
that's
I
a
have a Criterion collection that I'm working through
it's really good.
slowly.
That one is really good. In fact, you could actually, because that one is completely divorced from all the other Godzilla movies, so you could watch that one completely in isolation. And we did an episode on it a while back, and really good discussion we had about that. There was a lot of stuff in that one. It's very much a successor to that original one, and I still haven't seen -1 yet, but I definitely really want to see it, and I hear that is also in a very similar vein to that. Um, and another thing about this, the tokusatsu influence and all that, you can also see that, and I think I've talked about this on the show before, but my favorite example of that is the influence of, people obviously know that, Power Rangers in America they used the action footage, the sci-fi footage from the Japanese shows, and then intercut it with, footage of American actors in their civilian identities. But what a lot of people don't know is the whole reason that the Super Sentai, which is Power Rangers in Japan, the whole reason why they had giant robots and all that was because they did a Spider-Man show that Toei got the rights to, and basically the only thing they kept was the name Spider-Man and the costume, and they changed everything else about it. And they gave him a transforming giant robot, and it was this massive hit with kids, and they sold toys for this thing sold through the roof. So after that, they dusted off this Super Sentai concept, which at the time they didn't have giant robots in it, but then they added in giant robots to that, and they transform and they join together. So in a kind of roundabout way, you had American media influencing Japanese media, which then turns around and influences American media again.
Yeah, and I think or animation did the same thing. That you had Disney animation influencing anime, which
Mm-hmm.
is now in turn influencing Western animation again.
Yeah.
And so it's a very fun sort of balance to see that cycle through. Um, I'm reminded of Turning Red, which borrowed a lot of animation styles in it, and then also added kaiju. So
Mm-hmm.
you kind of had all the influences there.
Yeah, yeah. Or something like Pixar. I don't think you get to Pixar without having like Studio Ghibli and all that kind of stuff, where Studio Ghibli kind of like pioneered this model of these movies that, kids love and they go crazy about, but also there's a lot of stuff in there for adults too, and adults can really get into them as well. And I think Pixar really kind of picked up that ball and ran with it in a way that not many, even Disney wasn't able to really do before. But today we are talking about, you made a reference to it. Today we're talking about Kwaidan, which is a 1964 Japanese anthology horror film. Now, one of the interesting things about this is it's spelled Kwaidan with a W, but that is actually not how it's pronounced. And the reason why is because this is based on a anthology that was not necessarily written by, but it was kind of compiled and kind of reinterpreted by Lafcadio Hearn, who was an American who had moved to Japan, and he ended up becoming a Japanese citizen. In Japan, they know him by his Japanese name, Koizumi Yakumo, because back in those days, if you wanted to become a Japanese citizen, you had to take on a Japanese name. So he took on his wife's family name of Koizumi, and then he added his name of Yakumo to it. And one of the interesting things about that, so he had traveled all across Japan. He had collected all these different, local legends and ghost stories, and he had compiled them all together in a book, and he had translated them into English, and it was released in America as Kwaidan. And the reason why is because the original word for this in kind of archaic Japanese is Kwaidan, and so he decided to keep that spelling because this was like an archaic book to begin with. So, but in modern pronunciation, it's actually pronounced Kaidan without the W. So if anyone's confused about it, that's why you may have heard, like, if you hear people talking about it in Japanese or something, when they say Kaidan, they're not misreading it or anything. That is actually how it is supposed to be pronounced. Um, Another interesting thing about this is it's got 4 stories in it: the Black Hair, the Woman of the Snow, Hoichi the Earless, and In a Cup of Tea. Now, from the Kaidan anthology, only the Woman of the Snow and Hoichi the Earless are actually from that anthology. The Black Hair was actually a combination of 2 different stories. The Reconciliation and the Corpse Rider, both of those were in another collection called Shadowings. And then In a Cup of Tea was adapted from another book that Hearn wrote called Koto, being Japanese curios with sundry cobwebs. Now, I've taught many of the different stories in the Kaidan book in my literature classes, so I'm very familiar with them, especially Woman of the Snow and Hoichi the Earless. Those are probably the 2 that I've taught the most, and I've shown my students these film versions of it. So I've actually never seen this film all the way through until preparing it for it last night. I'd only seen The Woman of the Snow and Hoichi the Earless, and those are the only ones I had seen of it. And only now, last night, did I finally see Black Hair and In a Cup of Tea. So that's kind of my history with this movie. What about you? What is kind of your history with this movie?
So this started out as a movie that I stumbled upon about a decade ago because it was on television. And so at that point, there's a couple different versions of this movie.
Mm-hmm.
So the original version is about 3 hours.
Yes.
The first version that the US had was about 2 hours. And which actually the Woman of the Snow was entirely cut out.
Yeah, yeah.
And then when it was reintroduced, this got it up to about 2 hours, 40 minutes. And then most recently, there's a Criterion collection that brings it up to the full 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So I initially would have seen the version that's about 2 hours, 40 minutes. And so I'd stumbled upon that on TV and found it incredibly fascinating. And so I actually got the chance to see this in theater in early 2020. So it was, I believe, the last movie I saw in a movie theater for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
And then this time around, went through the Criterion Collection 3-hour version. So this is the first time that I've seen the full-length film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd read that too, that they had excised Yuki Onna out of the initial American releases, which kind of surprises me because I don't know. For me, at least, that is the most interesting. That's the most compelling story in this whole set. So I think Miminashi Hoichi is also really good, but I think it's a little bit too long. I think there's definitely some stuff in there you could cut out. And so, like, if I was going to rank these, Yuki Onna would be number 1 with a bullet. Miminashi Hoichi would probably be number 2. I think it's probably about even with Kurokami, and a big part of that is because of the length of Hoichi. If it was a little bit shorter, I think that would have put it above Black Hair. And then In a Cup of Tea is probably the one that interested me the least of these. How about you? Where did kind of you land on if you're going to rank the stories in it?
I mean, I definitely agree that the one that is highest for me is Woman in the Snow, because that the visuals of that are just the visuals in all of this is great, but
Mm-hmm.
that one is just breathtaking. Um, I think it would be Poetry the Earless second, although I definitely can see the issues with it going a bit longer, although I kind of feel like part of why it feels long is some of the stylistic decisions made in there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then the last one is sort of tough. I think I kind of enjoy Cup of Tea a little bit more, and I think part of that is because that one is a deliberately very ambiguous conclusion,
Mm-hmm.
and that one sort of lingers with me in a way that Black Hair doesn't quite as much.
Mm-hmm.
Although I kind of feel bad having to pick because I don't want to put any one of those last because they all. I do. This certainly is not a situation where it's like there's a weak story in there
Yeah. No,
bringing it down.
no, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they're all very good stories. Like none of these is like a waste of time. I wouldn't say like, you can just skip that one completely. You don't need it. I mean, there is something to there's something to enjoy in all of these ones. Um I think part of it too was just also In a Cup of Tea was the last one. And, at the end of like a 3 hour movie, then it's just kind of like, all right, I'm ready to be done with it too. I think there's an element of that in it as well. Uh, Another interesting thing about this is, you mentioned the visuals of Yuki Onna especially, and that's one thing that stands out to me every time I watch this was how this is all obviously shot on sound stages, but one of the things that really impresses me is the painted backgrounds of Yuki Onna really kind of resonate in a way that some of the other ones don't, because it really kind of feels like you are in a fantasy realm. They really make you feel like it's. I mean, if you look closely, you can tell that Yuki Onna is shot on a soundstage, but I think that one takes the most care to make you feel like you are in an actual location. Whereas, like I remember like the Don Oda battles in Hoichi feel a bit artificial, right? It's obvious they're not on an ocean front in that. I mean, it's just the water is so completely still, and you just don't really get the feel that this is this epic sea battle that it's supposed to be. Whereas Yuki Onna, even with the painted backgrounds, even though if you look closely, you can tell it's on a soundstage, it still does feel in those opening scenes like they are in the middle of a blizzard.
I th- I actually think certainly the way that they use the sound stages in Woman of the Snow is incredible. In part because they use sort of the backdrops to give these a very surreal element.
Yes, yeah.
Um, and so I think that works well with the fact that they've done so much work on the set in front of it to then have this surreal element introduced. And I think that's more of why I think in the battle with Hochi the Airless, that the way it's cutting between that battle and the tapestry artwork of it,
Mm-hmm.
I think also is more that it's not meant to look like it's the true depiction of what this would have looked like, but
Mm-hmm.
more it's bringing that art style to life in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so it doesn't have the sense of depth that real life would have, but then the artwork doesn't have that sort of a sense of depth to it either.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think in that point, it's more bringing that artwork to life in a way that I do really appreciate, even if a sense it has a sense of slowness to it, but I think it
Mm-hmm.
kind of works to make this feel like this is real people representing static images.
That's a good point. Yeah, I could see that too. Another thing about this is the film actually exhausted its budget while it was before it had finished production, and the director, um, Masaki Kobayashi, he actually had to sell his house to finish financing the rest of the film. And um, I do wonder how much of the budget, kind of where the bulk of the budget went to. If I was going to take a guess, my guess would probably be it went mostly to uh, Woman of the Snow. Would probably be where, because that one feels like the one where there's the most effort put into it, as far as like the set design and all that.
I think I'd actually, I Hoach of the Earless, I think to have the scale of those battles
That too, yeah.
and to have on water, the fact that the monastery, which still is all in a set, but the monastery is actually has a bridge over water and everything.
Mhm.
That has some parts that it really initially throws me to think that so much of this is on a set because they put so much effort into that.
Mhm.
And for it's clear when you have something that's very surreal about it, like Woman in the Snow. Some of the others, it doesn't stand out as much, and it kind of takes a little bit of thinking about it to realize that this is still a sound set. They've just done a very good job on it
Yeah,
and
I
lit
think
it
it was.
very well, so it feels
Yeah, I think
natural.
I think that was it. That was the case with the black hair, because there were some scenes in that where if you're not looking closely, you can't necessarily tell that some of those backgrounds are, these hand painted murals on it. But you look closely, like when he goes back to his to Kyoto, and you kind of see in the background there's like this fountain in the background or something. You look closely, you realize, oh wait, no, that's a painting back there. Whereas in something like Yukiona, the mural stands out a lot more, especially because it's, I think, also in big way because there's not so much blocking your view of it like there is in that scene. So yeah, I think that's also true as well. Like, it doesn't stand out as much as it does in Yukiona, where the whole focus is on these kind of bare foregrounds where there's not a whole lot in the foreground, but in the background, and it really makes those visuals and that kind of those surreal murals really kind of stand out.
Yeah, and I think some of that also comes from the color decisions that were made, and it's fascinating that this was his first color film, and this movie looks absolutely incredible, and it really uses bold colors, and I think especially in Woman of the Snow, there's this contrast between both the contrast between shots that are very, very limited to whites and blacks and maybe blue, and then shots that are meant to be much warmer, that have reds and oranges and yellows and these very bright skies. And then some of the shots that mix the two, and it's just this amazing contrast between stark white snow and a red sky, that it doesn't feel like it's a normal part of the world, but it's absolutely breathtaking to me.
Mm. Yeah, and speaking of that, one of the things that stands out to me every time I watch Moon of the Snow um, is that contrast between Keiko Kishi when she is playing the Snow Woman and when she's playing Yuki, the kind of like human form of her. And when she's the when she's the Snow Woman, she's very pale. She's got this kind of like blue light on her, and but then when she's in, and she's also wearing all white. But when she's playing the Yuki part, she's she's obviously not painted white anymore. She's lit with like much warmer light. She's dressed in warmer clothing, and also Kishi does a really good job of differentiating between those two sides of it. Like, I think if you didn't know any better, you'd be forgiven for thinking those were two different actresses playing that part.
Yeah, it makes it very believable that that it being realized that they're the same person is a realization, that it's
Mm-hmm.
not simply obvious. I think even elements of things like posture play a role into differentiating those two performances, and then
Yeah.
again the way that they use the lighting to the point that I believe there's even a couple scenes where they shift the lighting so you have in a single shot you allow to kind of go between those characters
Hmm.
or those sides of the same character, I guess I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Now, are you familiar with any of the original stories that these uh, um, short films were based on?
The only one that I'd say I'm even sort of familiar with is for Hochi the Earless, and it's not the story itself, but since this is a story that's set, and this is set a couple hundred, meant to be a couple hundred years after a large battle,
Hmm.
um, and one of the things it talks about is the element of the legend of that battle
Hmm.
being that the crabs now have human faces
Right.
on them.
The Heike crabs. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I've heard about the crabs,
Hmm.
and so all of that is kind of the sort of the prelude to the main point of that story. But that was one that I had familiarity with that part of it.
Hmm. Yeah. So I've read like I said, I've taught both the Snow Woman of the Snow and Hoichi the Earless a lot in my classes, so I'm very familiar with both of those stories. I have not read the original versions. You know, Black Hair was based on two different stories, and then Cup of Tea was. I'm not sure exactly if it was one story or if I'm not. I'm not familiar of Hearn's Koto, so I don't know what kind of the backstory is behind that. But
I know. I think that one is it's one story, but then sort of the framing device that it's using
okay,
is new, since that
okay,
is the incomplete story. But then you have an additional element of what has happened to the writer, and
okay.
I believe that is introduced from the film.
Okay, so that's kind of similar to Rashomon, where the actual story of Rashomon is not actually from the story titled Rashomon. It's actually from another story called In a Bamboo Grove, and then the framing device is kind of very loosely inspired by the Rashomon story, but it's completely different too. Like basically just the the fact that they're at the Rashomon gate is really the only thing they take from that story. But that whole framing device is basically completely new, and it's based on elements from the um, the Inner Grove story. So it sounds like they did something similar with Cup of Tea. Uh, but I will say, between with Woman of the Snow and Hoichi the Earless, I think Woman of the Snow is the one that is the closest to the original story. It is like the only things that are really different from it are um, pretty much like the number of kids, right? In the story, it's something like I think they have like 10 children, but in the movie, then they only have like I think it's only three they have. So that's really kind of the biggest change there is, and obviously some little dialogue bits here and there. But for the most part, it is very faithful to that original story. Hoichi does something interesting, and because one of the they kind of reverse the order of stuff a little bit because one of the things I like about the original story is that when the attendant first appears to Hoichi, there's it's not really obvious that he's a ghost, right? Whereas in the movie, you see him, appear out of nothing. So there's something supernatural going on here. Plus, there's this whole, kind of subplot about these people being found dead that is completely absent from the original. And so there's a bit more ambiguity in the original story where you're actually not sure if the ghosts are going to be a danger to Hoichi or not. And um, because especially like at the end when he pulls the Hoichi's ears off in the story, it's not written as if it's maliciously. He's just like, oh, I see these ears, I'll just take them and go, and then he just takes them and he walks away. um Whereas in the movie you see him like struggling, and they're fighting on the ground, and the look on the attendant's face makes it seem like it's a much more deliberate act of malevolence. So the spirits seem much more malevolent in the movie version compared to the original story. And the ambiguity, they do have some ambiguity, but it's in a different way. The ambiguity in the story is whether or not the ghosts are a danger and whether they're ghosts or not in the first place. You don't find out until about like halfway into the story. Whereas in the movie, you know they're ghosts right from the start, but the ambiguity comes from what is Hoichi doing? Because you see him going off night after night, but we don't actually see him perform until that last night. And it's flipped in the other version. In the other version, you see him perform first, and then they just kind of summarize, well, then he went again and again.
I believe one of the other ambiguities, this is something the audio commentary discusses, is the way that this ends with the ambiguity of additional people coming to hear Hoichi, and it being explicitly said that they can't tell whether or not these are more ghosts or real people.
Ah, okay, that's a good point. I didn't realize that because that's not ambiguous in the story. The story, it's very much stated that he became very rich because people wanted to come see his story, and there's no suggestion that they might be more ghosts. Um,
Yeah,
so I don't
there's
know what do you feel about those different ambiguities, kind of based. I know you haven't read the story, but just based on the kind of summaries I gave, what do you think of the changes they made?
so one of the things is that really that decision of making it clear that this is a ghost from the start.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to me, at least, I don't get as clear of a sense of definitely what is their intentions with him. So I think there's still an ambiguity of what is happening up until you kind of get to the reveal of no, you've been attending ghosts.
Mm-hmm.
We need to do something about this because this is very dangerous. And some of that may be that I don't necessarily have a. There may be a cultural familiarity to go that this is definitely an uncertain spot. But for me, going into this, even knowing they're ghosts, their intention doesn't really feel clear,
Mm-hmm.
really until it's stated.
Yeah.
So to me, that still holds off as fairly effective. And then I don't view the taking of the ears quite as maliciously. And I think some of that may be because they do a great job of showing, sort of exploring the boundary between one world and the next,
Mm-hmm.
and going between where you have Hochi clearly visible and you have sort of this double exposure of the ghost present, so that there's sort of this translucence to it. And then in one shot, they just switch over without a cut to now the ghost is fully formed, and all you see really of Hochi is an outline of the ears, and seeing that it does feel like, to me at least, that the intent still is just intending to take the ears. It's just that there's more of a difficulty to that, but that it does feel like he just figures, well, I need to bring the ears back because that's my task, without having it. It still doesn't feel like he's aware that this is tearing the ears off of someone per se.
Mm-hmm.
Like it has the sense that because you see it, that it's outside of his perception, that the rest of Hochi is there.
Yeah. I think probably the fact that I read the story before I saw the movie definitely kind of colored my opinions of that. So for me, it felt a lot more malevolent in comparison to the story. Um, Another big change in this is the kind of the comic relief characters that pop up in this, right? They were completely absent in the story. There's like almost, you get the head priest in there, and then there are mention of like these other monks who are around, but they're all kind of nameless, faceless characters in that original story. And I think I can respect the attempt to give them more of a personality. I think then the fact that you've got Takashi Shimura playing the head priest is a big reason for some of that, right? You've got one of the biggest actors in Japan at the time. You're going to want to give him a little bit more to do as opposed to just be like this faceless background character. But some of the the comic relief stuff, I felt that they kind of stretched that a little bit far. How did you feel about that?
I'm not sure I'd say they stretch it far, but it definitely does feel notable compared to the other three stories. Really don't have anything comparable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's some bits that I think one could make a case for in one or two spots, but you don't really have this sense of comic relief, and it's an interesting thing that it doesn't shift the overall tone,
Mm-hmm.
but it is a little bit surprising that that's introduced into one of them without really having something similar in the others.
Yeah, and so heavily in this one in comparison to the others, because and all the others, they're much more lean, right? Like, I mean, I think if I'm remembering correctly, In a Cup of Tea is probably the shortest one. I think it's only like 30 minutes long. Um, Whereas this one is, I can't remember the exact length of this, but I remember feeling like this feels like a lot longer compared to a lot of the other stories.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes out of that both the initial prologue of the battle and then sort of an additional retelling of parts of the battle where you're actually
Hmm.
hearing Hochi doing it.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Black Hair. Like, this is one that, again, this is my first introduction to this story, and I liked a lot of this story. I think the effects of the black hair attacking him, that felt like one of the places where maybe they were kind of straining with the budget a little bit. How did you feel about Black Hair?
Um, I think it sets a very good tone for this whole anthology because it has this use of silence
Hmm.
in such a fascinating way, and it extends through all of these. But that you have silence, and the sound that you do have generally make it conveys this sense of both of discomfort and things being out of place. And so even within this, you have things that would in most films cause sound,
Hmm.
things like cracking wood, and you have sound effects that are fairly close to cracking wood, and those are not at all synchronized. And so it does do this very good job of the whole thing is the whole thing feels off. It creates this sort of this mood and this atmosphere
Hmm.
that pervades the whole thing, and it starts with how they use it in Black Hair. Um, and I can very easily imagine how, with some of the shocks in Black Hair, how most other movies would have synchronized their sound and
Hmm.
to emphasize those jarring moments. Whereas here, the sound really is very minimalist and really keeps one on edge. And it's this, and between that, and then you also have very dynamic camera movements,
Hmm.
particularly I think in Black Hair, of the way this uses rotating cameras and moving cameras and so many shots
Hmm.
that you never feel totally at ease, particularly when it's once he's returned back home. Um, like the only area that really feels sort of normal is when he's abandoned his wife and he's headed off,
Hmm.
and then you have things like atmospheric sounds that are present, and things feel a bit normal, sort of more of this world before he returns back, and things again have this very otherworldly nature. And I think it's what captivates me so much with this is just across the board how it does that. But
Yeah.
Black Hair does a very good job of starting with that. Um, I think the ending may not be as consistently strong as the rest of that.
Hmm.
Um, and that's just that a little bit of it starts to feel ridiculous. With the hair sort of attacking him, kind of thing feels a bit odd.
Yeah, with like the hair like kind of jumping at him and all that. Those are parts where I felt kind of weird watching that. But yeah, other than, I agree with you completely on all that stuff. I mean, that whole sequence when he gets back to Kyoto, there is this looming sense of dread behind everything. Even when he sees his ex-wife there and he's talking to her, and just like the way she's speaking to him, you can tell that there is something off. And I don't have the luxury of remembering what the Hoichi and Woman of the Snow were like the first time I watched them because it's been so long. But also, I had read those stories before I watched it too, so there were no real surprises in there for me. Whereas this movie, I was going into this the with the black hair, I was going into this completely cold. So I mean, it's not like a jaw dropping surprise or anything to when you find out that his ex wife has been dead the whole time, but I was expecting something like that to happen anyway, but they still do a really good job of just like seeding that dread in there and building up to that even if you see that coming, it's still, that buildup is still very well executed.
Yeah, and I think it's with all of these. Um, I had the convenience to take. I was using Letterboxd a decade ago, and went back over my review from when I first saw this. And a lot of it is sort of knowing that something is going to happen, but I never felt with any of these stories my first time through it that I knew what.
Mm-hmm.
Something, there is the sense of unease. Something was going to occur, but it wasn't particularly clear exactly what those things were going to be. Nothing felt particularly telegraphed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so then that leaves In a Cup of Tea. What were some of your thoughts about this story?
I feel like this is the one that I wish I had a better understanding of just what was being attempted with it. Since it's
Mm-hmm.
this interesting, there's elements here that, and I hit this with watching foreign films every so often, where it feels like there's additional interpretations that I should be seeing that I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
Um, since so the premise here is um, we're drinking tea that he's seen a reflection of someone in it, and then it's that person coming to get revenge for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's elements of that it feels closer to, of anything here, it's the closest one that feels like a Twilight Zone episode that would be particularly distinctive in that I don't have any sort of cultural reference points to attach that to in the way that the more traditional ghost stories I do. So that's the one where there's always the sense of, what am I missing about this?
I kind of felt the same way too, and I chalked it a lot up to it was late at night. I was already kind of tired. We had a long day, so I feel like this is definitely one that I really need to revisit the most because I don't feel like I have a good handle on uh, what happened.
Yeah.
And
And
it
then,
looks like I'm not the only one too. Like not based on what you said too. Just like kind of looking on like Reddit and other places, it seems a lot of people are kind of a little bit lost with this one. And I wonder if the intention was just kind of that because this kind of ambiguity happens a lot in Japanese horror, and I do wonder if maybe that's why. Because all the other stories they have like there's a finality to all of them, whereas this one there is kind of like this sense of what just happened, and that's kind of the sense you get with movies like One Missed Call or or Ju-on or even Ring to a certain extent too, right? Even though there is an ending to that movie, it does end with the implication that this is going to keep on happening. So I think maybe that's the only thing I can think of really is maybe it's
I
just
mean,
to stress that ambiguity that's common in Japanese horror.
well, the two elements that kind of, one element, and this is one that I listened to the audio commentary for this earlier today, and so I haven't had a chance to go back and rewatch it with this. One of the points that they do raise is there is sort of a significance to a clock
Mm-hmm.
in here, and one element of that does stand out with that is, for as much as this movie uses silence, you hear that clock very notably.
Mm-hmm.
And so one element is that is calling attention to the clock. And then also it is the shadow of the clock is where sort of this other figure appears from and
Mm-hmm.
leaves act. And so you do have this, there's some question about how this is apparently meant to link to time, which is an element that I feel like I need to rewatch with that in mind and sort of see what's there. And then that does kind of fit on some sense that you have a framing device that is what would have been contemporary to when these were being collected into the books, and then a jump back in time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then the other element of it is just this idea of a story that isn't fully complete. Um, which I think is the sort of thing that is an interesting angle to do as well, is to explore the idea that when you have stories that are being passed over long periods of time, they don't always stay intact.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm trying to remember, and I want to say it may be something weird like Fellini's Satyricon or something that is based off of an old story that doesn't have a complete telling.
Mm-hmm.
And so the movie just acknowledges this is the point where we don't know what happens next,
Right.
because this is all the story we have, and they didn't try to make up an ending for it. And so there is a little bit of that sense that appears to be here of this is the story as it has survived. We don't know the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an interesting thing that I kind of enjoy, seeing something willing to do that rather than fully conclude it.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't write any. The comment that comes up when the story is found and the writer's missing is basically, I got to this point in the story and I couldn't come up with how this should end, so I'm leaving it up to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's an interesting thing to explore, and I think it is sort of an embracing of an ambiguity that I think is what makes all of Kwaidan so effective.
Mm-hmm.
Is how much of this feels to embrace an ambiguity or an uncertainty, because that really is what plays into sort of the moods that makes this so evocative.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what I find so interesting about that is I think it's what makes this both something I enjoy so much, but also why I feel that this is very difficult to approach, especially if you're coming at this from a Western horror film perspective,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because this is so different from really a lot of horror in general, to not focus on large scares, but to create a mood that's uncomfortable and sort of otherworldly.
Mm-hmm.
And even for the other horror anthologies that were being made around the same time in the West, this is just a dramatically different feel. It's I'm hard pressed to think of movies that I think of as ghost stories that have so much about atmosphere, and it's not, there's scary bits, but
Mm-hmm.
that these aren't about scaring, but they still are unnerving and uncomfortable in the same way that a ghost story is, but without having the sudden jolts per se.
Yeah, there's not a lot of that in here at all. It's completely atmospheric. There's the closest thing you even get to like anything even remotely resembling a jump scare would probably be the hair kind of leaping out at the in Black Hair. But even that, it's just, and you can tell that that's not Kobayashi's forte, because it doesn't really feel like that fits in. I think with Black Hair especially, I really feel like it would have been better if we saw like the hair like creeping up on him, or something like that, some other way of doing that. Um, yeah, it's pretty much just all atmosphere, and that's where most of it comes from. It's not a scary movie. It's just more you feel unsettled by different things you see. Like nobody's going to be watching this movie and screaming during it.
Yeah, I think it's a situation where, because it's so often listed as horror, I think it's much closer to like dark fantasy.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. So are there any other things that really kind of stood out to you about Kaidan? Anything that we haven't mentioned yet?
I think one of the things that I would mention with this, because a lot of this is, or points that I made earlier, was how this has, it heavily relies on sound and it sort of discordant, or heavily relies on silence and has discordant sound that doesn't necessarily match what you're seeing. It does things like talk about, you hear about the drummers drumming and showing the drummers drumming, and you don't actually hear it. You just hear it. You're just told that's what's happening. So
Mm-hmm.
this heavy use on silence and very minimalist sound was, this actually motivated me to watch Zaki Kobayashi's previous film, Harry Carey, which I hadn't seen before, and it was even more fascinating to see how much more conventional that movie feels in terms of a, its score, its ambient sound,
Mm-hmm.
um, the camera work being good but not having this otherworldly nature. And it, for me at least, it really made this stand out so much more to see that this wasn't just an element of his style,
Mm-hmm.
but that it really makes all of this feel very deliberate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that it didn't stumble into being this good at sort of feeling not quite right for the world,
Mm-hmm.
and really creating the sense that you're not dealing with the world as you're used to it, and that
Yeah.
pervades through all four of these in ways that I think are not as obvious as, it's one thing to be like, that's a ghost. It's another thing to
Mm-hmm.
really start to notice, the sound doesn't match up, and it's in a deliberate way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very well said too. And yeah, I really like this movie as well. I think it's you'd mentioned the colors as well, even just like in the opening segment where you've got all these like swirling colors back and forth. Um, is really well done, and it's you know again got some issues with that black hair, but other than that, it holds up very well. And it is one of those things where if you're kind of intimidated by that 3 hour runtime, you know, it's four stories, so it's very easy to break this apart into like four different viewing sessions if you want to. Um,
The other thing I think helps with that is, because so much of this is about creating this atmosphere, so much of this is reliant on silence,
mhm,
is, or especially coming from the perspective of having to rely on the subtitles, there's not that much dialogue in this.
mhm,
You usually have some narration that sets things up, and you have a whole lot that is not reliant on any dialogue because it's using colors and sound, um, and even pacing to some extent to create a mood that you can really just sort of focus on that. And it doesn't make this feel as long as it would be if this was 3 hours of talking.
mhm. No, absolutely, yeah. In fact, I think a lot of these stories you could probably watch without subtitles, and you could follow them pretty well. In fact, I remember when I think one of the first time I showed Woman of the Snow to my students, there was some issue with the video file or whatever, and for some reason the subtitles were not working, so I could not have the subtitles on when I was watching the movie with them. And obviously I'd read the story, so I was already familiar with it all, but I did not feel at any point like I didn't understand what was happening, even without the use of subtitles. So if even if you don't, I mean, this movie does a very good job of getting it across without without really much of a language barrier. You can follow this very well, whether or not you use subtitles with it.
Yeah, it's very much creating this without it being dialogue heavy.
Hmm.
It also means I think so many of these shots are just visually stunning that it really just is taking those in, and you're not, which is not as much work trying to work through
Hmm.
as if this was trying to go through, a dialogue based scene.
Yeah. Yeah. I will also say that if you're looking for this movie, and I've called it Kaidan, but it is spelled Kwaidan on the DVDs. So if you're looking for this movie, do make sure you get the one with the W in it, because that's the one from 1964. There is another movie that uses the modern spelling of Kaidan, which came out in 2007. Um, it's directed by Hideo Nakata, who directed the Ring, and um, I've never seen this movie, so I don't know if it's good or not. But I just wanted to let people know that it is a completely different movie. So if you're looking for Kaidan, make sure you get the correct version from 1964.
Yeah, and for that matter, also paying attention to which runtime you're getting.
Yeah, I was going to say that too, but I was just doing a search on Amazon US, and I think all the versions I'm seeing on here, at least all the versions that are, basically in print, seem to be ones that have the 3 hour version. So if you're watching it on like Amazon or on Max, I think you're pretty safe with that version, the 3 hour version. There is also apparently there's another movie called Kwaidan as well, which seems to only be out on VHS. And um, oh wait, no, this is the same one. This is the same one. It's just got a very strange cover to it. It makes it look completely different. But yeah, the so and this so yeah, if you're looking for VHS copies, and I think that's the 2 hour and 44 minute one. But if you're on DVD or on streaming or on Blu-ray, I think you'll be safe with the 3 hour version. But you just might want to double check that it does have that 3 hour runtime on it.
Yeah, and to be fair, there's not too much that I noticed as a difference in that.
Mm-hmm.
I have some idea where some of those scenes were, because it is mostly Woman of the Snow that has changed in duration. Um, but it didn't. There wasn't anything that I watched and really went, I definitely don't remember that
Mm-hmm.
for the most part. So it's extending it without, but I think all the good bits are still, or all the key bits are still in the slightly shorter version. It's
Yeah.
just a little bit more fleshed out.
Okay, so Mike, thanks so much for coming on. Why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, so you can check out my podcast, The Old Switcheroo. That's within Switch A Roo. Anywhere you find podcasts, or at theoldswitcheroo.com. And then for all my movie thoughts, I am on Letterboxd as Lobacca, Lowbacca, which will have 3 reviews now of Kwaidan, as I get to go back through this again from another perspective. So thank you very much for having me on. It's been a blast to talk about this. I do love this movie. It's one of my top 4 on Letterboxd, because I find it absolutely breathtaking, and it's a joy to come back to it and go through it more and learn a bit more about the literature sources for this, and just that I still am appreciating this movie as much as I do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on too. Thanks for picking this movie. This is one that I've had on the list for a while, so I'm glad I finally got to knock it out. Also, yeah, definitely check out the stories that it's based on, especially the ones in the Kaidan anthology, which that has Hoichi the Earless and Woman of the Snow in it. Anyone else too, definitely. In fact, all of those stories are in the public domain, so like you can go get them from Project Gutenberg to download them. So you can get them for free completely. There's also Japanese versions on, I think it's Aozora Bunko is the name of the website. If you can read Japanese, if you're interested in seeing the original Japanese translations, you can find them there as well. But yeah, that does it for this episode of Japan on Film. Thanks so much. We are japanonfilm.com is the website. Japan on Film on the socials, which is basically Blue Sky, Threads, and Instagram these days. So please check us out. And if you are interested in supporting my work, I have a comic book out now called Paragons of Earth, which I did with Thomas DJ and Eric Johns. You can find information about that at crowdfunder.com/paragonscomic. That is crowdfundernoe.com/paragonscomic. Please go check that out. Help support us that way. And again, we are part of the We Made This podcast network. So listen up after the credits to hear what is coming up next. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the We Made This podcast network. Visit japanonfilm.com for show notes, episodes, merchandise, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at JapanOnFilm. If you'd like to help support the show, you can donate at japanonfilm.com, wemadethisnetwork.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find links with information about each guest and join the discussion on the We Made This Discord in the show notes of each episode. And now, listen to hear what's coming up next on the We Made This Network.
Hello, and this is Frame to Frame, part of the We Made This podcast network. We are a podcast that take two seemingly unconnected films and slam them together with the most obscure theme that we can find. I'm Andy Williams.
And I'm Sean Wilson.
And every Wednesday, you'll be able to find out a little bit more about the different themes and different films that we look into, with insights such as this.
You're literally crying with laughter as you're recording, because it just snowballs on and on and on. And it kind of reaches this kind of idiotic nirvana. As in, like, what is he doing? This is the guy that made The Sixth Sense?
The fact that it ends where they, oh my gosh, we're in two separate places, but we need to get outside to see to each other, to be together. And then they look at each other, and then nothing happens.
so it's the unhappening, and it's like, and,
the big twist, the big M. Night Shyamalan twist at the end of the film is that nothing happens. You know, the very bothersome thing on Rotten Tomatoes that you cited about the idea that there is somehow a difference between the way critics see movies and audiences see movies. Well, yes, but critics watch films as an audience, so critics are an audience. So that's a complete fatuous thing. The reason critics get into criticism is because they love it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That's all that it is. The reason we do this podcast is because we love film.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as a wrong reason to laugh at Moonfall. Legitimately, I had so much fun. And I remember telling you at the time, on our Roundup of the Year podcast, we will be doing Moonfall. And you said,
and you remember my
no,
face.
We won't.
Yeah, I mean, how crestfallen I was.
And I said, oh, yes, we will.
Yeah, I mean, never mind Moonfall, crestfallen is what I would call it.
Be sure to check your podcast app of choice every Wednesday to find new episodes. You'll be able to like, subscribe, and find us on social media at Frame to Frame Pod.
Do you like crime stories, books, and people talking about those things? Then you should check out the Read and Buried podcast.
A murder? Oh.
I'm Frankie.
And I'm Sarah.
And in each episode, we pick a different theme and surprise and delight each other with a cheeky little review.
As you started reading it, I was like, this sounds like a romance novel. And then you got to monstrous crime.
Yay, there it is. That's what we're here for, isn't it?
We're also regularly visited by many talented and best-selling authors, including the likes of Chris Whitaker, Elizabeth Haynes, Emma Stonex, Fiona Cummins, and a whole lot more.
I obviously listened to the podcast, and I listened to you interviewing Chris Whitaker, and I thought, oh, hey, that sounds like a really good fun podcast.
If you like your crime books with a big side of silly, this is the podcast for you. Listen to the Read and Buried podcast right now, brought to you by the We Made This Network.